Hey, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Renn. Aaron is a writer and a consultant in Indianapolis in the USA. He's a co-founder and senior fellow with the American Reformer. He's also the author of the brilliant book, Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. And I advise you to check out his terrific Substack as well. So just to begin then, Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about some of your key influences, whether that be intellectual, in your family life, or whichever?
Yeah, I'm influenced by a number of things. I'm influenced by the different professional backgrounds that I've had. One, I was in management consulting for a long time. So that's sort of the analytical framework I bring to the world. I really think you have to look at people's professional lens. That tells you a lot about how they see the world. Most people see the world through the lens of their profession. I was also a finance major in undergrad, so I was never like a real finance guy, but I have some knowledge of finance and accounting. And then I did a lot of software development. So I think like a computer programmer as well. And then, of course, journalist and my kind of interest in cities and culture comes from I did some work there. Uh, some of the thinkers I'm very influenced in my thinking by people like Nassim Taleb, the former options trader. He wrote the book The Black Swan, which is the one everybody's heard of, but I don't think it's the one you need to read as much. Like Fooled by Randomness and Anti-Fragile, I think have a lot of very profound insights about the way the world works. And when I think about my own life, I realize it kind of lines up with those concepts and it gives a lens to understand that. There's also an American sociologist, E. Digby Baltzell, Baltzell. He was the foremost scholar of the American upper class. You know, we didn't have a posh aristocracy, but we had what we called the WASP
Mhm.
elites, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So very influential there. The sociologist James Davison Hunter is another one that I've looked at. The radical Catholic social critic Ivan Illich would be another one. And then some of the writing on kind of elite theory and managerialism, like James Burnham's Managerial Revolution, has also been somewhat influential um, on my thought. Um, some of the stuff people write about media, whether it be Neil Postman or Baudrillard, people like that. Never read Marshall McLuhan actually, but he'd be very interesting there. One thing you notice from that is all of these people are modern and contemporary thinkers. And I think that is one of the things that distinguishes me from your typical person in this space who's very enamored of classical thinkers or the great books. We want to talk about Plato and Aristotle. We want to talk about, the founding fathers of America. We want to talk about, people who wrote books in the Middle Ages or something like that. Thomas Aquinas. I'm not opposed to that stuff. But we live in a modern, technological, industrialized, urbanized society that is quite different. And so I think we need to spend a lot of time thinking about the unique conditions of modernity. And so that's a lot of what I've put my thought into.
Oh, that's excellent, Aaron. And that's music to my ears. Some of those people that you mentioned have deeply informed me, especially Illich, who I've most appreciated over the years. And to a lesser extent, Taleb also. I think he's amazing. And I love that because a lot of the focus of my channel is about classical education and so on. And I reference Lewis and old books and things like that. That does have its place, but your work is a wonderful complement to that, I would suggest.
No,
And for
oh,
the
thank you.
and I want to ask you in part inspired by what you describe as this influence from your managerial background and how it informs your view of the world, how you get that healthy balance then between that distinct emphasis and this emphasis in modernity and distinct theological categories that have come across the ages. I think here of someone like Eugene Peterson in the States and how he cautioned in some of his books about focusing too much on the church as a business and how that manifested itself, say, with mega churches and they were made an idol of the business goals. Not that necessarily business is bad in and of itself, and I don't even think he would suggest that. I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't. One of the characteristics of my work is that it is not really theological in that sense. I don't. I sort of kind of lucked into that, and I've decided to stick with it because if I start talking about theology, then other people are going to run rings around me because they're so much better educated on that topic. I will say I've had exposures to different streams of American evangelical religion, having grown up in a rural Assemblies of God Pentecostal church that was very much in the culture war religious right mode during the 1980s and even the 70s, perhaps. And then, as an adult, mostly in kind of urban Reformed churches, Presbyterian, Presbyterian. So that would be I do have some exposure to those, but I think that there are definitely overlaps between these concepts in the church. So there's a great doctoral dissertation by a gentleman named Christopher Schlecht called Onward Christian Administrators. And it's very fascinating. And he really talks about how the church became managerialized and bureaucratized in the early 20th century. That led to a functional understanding of church roles, which paved the way for women's ordination. That essentially his argument that was like women's ordination in the Presbyterian church was primarily a function of managerialization of the church. Because once positions, again, are conceived of functionally and bureaucratically, then there's really no reason why you would not have women's ordination. And so that's also one of the reasons why, like a male only priesthood doesn't compute for a lot of people today. Those sorts of things there. So I think that these concepts definitely bear sort of on the church. The other thing is that the Bible was written in an entirely pre-industrial society. So you really have to understand the cultural context of pre-industrial, agricultural, tribal, even village urban societies, really understand what's going on uh, in these places. And then we have to think about what does that mean in our world? It's not always obvious what it means, but we don't understand. We tend to read everything under the lens of our own cultural conditions, as opposed to the cultural conditions of the time. And so, those are some of the things that I'd throw out there.
Hmm. Thanks for that, Aaron. And I want to move now to discuss a bit about the negative world. So, one of the key themes in your book is this idea of the negative world. For viewers of mine, maybe who aren't familiar with your work, can you describe that briefly, what you mean by the term negative world, and maybe why, especially Christians, should be conscious of that?
Yes, I'm probably best known for this three worlds of evangelicalism thesis. So, unlike in much of Europe, America never had a state church, but we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion for most of our history. So, as recently as the 1950s, half of all adults in America attended church. That was actually the high watermark of church attendance. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools, our government schools. We had we were adding under God to the Pledge of Allegiance and putting in God we trust on our money. Uh, then in the 1960s, that started to become unraveled. The status of Christianity went into decline. And that's a decline that continues to the present day. And I divide the period of decline from roughly 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from, say, 1964 to 1994. And in the positive world, I want to be clear, this is a period of decline for Christianity in America. Church attendance is down, all is not well. And yet, society still basically viewed Christianity positively. To be known as a good church-going man made you seem like an upstanding member of society. Christian moral norms were the actual moral norms of the country, and if you violated them, you could get into trouble. In 1994, we hit a tipping point and entered the neutral world, which lasted from 1994 to 2014. And in the neutral world, Christianity is no longer seen positively, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And Christian morality has a certain residual effect at that time. Then in 2014, we had a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, in sort of official elite culture now views Christianity negatively or certainly at least skeptically. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and in some ways is seen as a new threat to the new emerging moral order. And this shift into this negative world, this negative space, has been profoundly dislocating to American Christians.
Hmm. And what were some of the major trends or events that distinctly caused that shift to an explicitly negative world?
Yeah, people ask me that a lot, and I don't take a stance on causation. I think that history is sort of a contingent outworking of many things. And there are a lot of people that's got the where did it all go wrong moment. So
Yeah.
some people say it was William of Ockham and nominalism. Some people, Catholics, like to say it was the Reformation or it was the Enlightenment. Um, but so I don't think there's a where did it all go wrong moment, but I do think there were some couple major milestones along the way. One was the collapse of that old WASP establishment that I talked about, which happened in the 1960s as well. And for these people, Protestantism really was a sort of part of the definition of their community. Like if you were Catholic or Jewish, you were not necessarily going to get invited into their clubs, for example. And so these people weren't especially religious, many of them, but so long as they were dominating the country, clearly they would never have allowed a sort of anti-Protestant attitude to take root because that would have destroyed one of the things that defined the boundary of their community. So I think that was really key. But really super important was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So why were we adding in God we trust to our money and under God to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s? Cold War. Communism was this avowedly atheist materialist system, and religion, Christianity, was very bound up with the West's moral war against the Soviet Union. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the subsequent kind of collapse of communism, that really enabled people to unbundle Christianity from what it meant to be, a Western liberal democratic society. So I think those were really two key events.
That's really interesting. And I've most appreciated your book and similar books about the history of the USA. And I'm always cognizant of how things are different in Ireland, for example, and how the lessons might be applied here and what extent that's possible. I wonder if you might go into that and how these trends might differentiate according to different cultures and nations, say, between somewhere like Ireland and Britain, even, and versus the USA. And I wondered in part because you mentioned that more agrarian element to the Bible and so on. Wendell Berry and folks like that in the States have brought that to the forefront in some ways and looked at the importance of agriculture and culture in interrelationship and so on. And I think some of his ideas maybe would work better in a small nation like Ireland, where there's still a strong localist emphasis and so on. And I don't know if that manifests itself the same way in the States, on, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't really know enough about other countries to say anything uh, uh, definitive on it.
Mhm.
So clearly there are issues. And so one of the uh, examples I give in the book, and it's a good example of why I shouldn't be talking about foreign countries, because it was an Australian sports team who hired a president that had been a banker. He'd been a successful banker in the country for a long time, a major business figure. And they didn't like his church, too conservative, held retrograde views. So they were basically forced to fire him after like a day. So clearly, there's things going on there in Australia. Now, of course, I screwed up because I called it a soccer team and it was actually a Australian rules football. So I get, you miss the basics and you kind of like there. So I'm like, see, this is why I shouldn't be talking about foreign countries. So what I would definitely say about Ireland, though, is the role of the Catholic Church in Ireland was different than the role of the churches in the United States. Um, and therefore, most likely, the relationship between church and state and the way people see religion is going to be driven by the particularities of that relationship and the role that the church played in society, much more so than the United States, where the United States was a very Protestant country, and it was there were many, many different Protestant churches. We didn't, just like in England, they have a state church, Church of England. Well, we had an Anglican church, the Episcopalian Church, which was the church of the elites. But we also have Presbyterians, we have Baptists, we have Methodists, we had Lutherans, we had a lot of them. And so there was always a sort of, that's why I call it generic Protestantism. There was not this particularized relationship between, um, church and state in that way. And it was always more, there's always been more of a pluralistic marketplace in a tradition of religious freedom in America that, didn't necessarily exist in other countries, in European countries. So I'm a little hesitant to suggest, and that's why I really focused. Although I think people in Europe have found a lot to value about the book, and I sold a number of copies in Australia and things like that. It really is specific to America. So like these years and things like that, that's not going to apply in Europe. Although of course the same trends are present there, for sure. There's no doubt about that. So I think it is very interesting to look at these formerly hyper-Catholic countries, regions like Quebec or Ireland that have seen essentially total collapse in religious adherence. Both went through like total collapse in religious adherence in very short period of time. And definitely there's like major differences between the sorts of social states that exist in historically Catholic countries versus historically Protestant countries. And so that's all I can say. It's one of Taleb's things he always talks about is, things are fractal. If you've ever heard the term fractal, so that things repeat at different scales, but they're not exact repetition. So the family is sort of a representation of the nation, but it's not exactly the same. There's important differences at different scales. And so I think that applies horizontally as well. The same things are happening in all of these different countries in the West, but they're not exact replicas of each other. They've each got their own unique character to it. One thing I have heard, and I actually hope that it's true, from like Rod Dreher, when he talks about going to places like France and talks to these young Catholics, these young millennial Catholics, 30-something Catholics, 20-something Catholics, they're no longer burdened by the idea that religion, was anything. We know we're like this minority of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you sort of adjust to that psychology, you can feel a lot more optimistic about your future. You don't have, whereas I think in America, because it is still a very religious country, far more religious than other countries. And, in kind of within a living memory, Christianity had a sort of dominant place in society. You end up with this kind of like sense of loss over that. And it's very hard psychologically to escape that. Whereas if you're sort of in a pre-collapsed society, you're going to view things differently.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing to think about. Now, Ireland in particular has a lot of it seems to be there's a lot of political and cultural turmoil right now. So I don't know exactly how that's going to play out for you guys.
Mm. No, that's really interesting, and in some ways, I appreciate that silver lining because in some ways, like Illich talks about, the corruption of the best is the worst. The church in Ireland was so tied to the state and everything, and committed such horrific acts that it was such a perversion of genuine Christianity that now it makes sense that people have revolted so vociferously against it, but then the state has managed to scapegoat the church and run away sort of scot-free, which is disturbing. But there is that
Right.
element of people being more conscientious about their faith. It's the remnant, as you might hear about. You hear Martin Thornton, the Anglican, talk about the faithful remnant, even within the Church of England and so on. And like Ronner talks about the mystical Christian of the future and so on. I think there's some serious interest and silver linings to it. But what you mentioned about fractal patterns and that notion of scale that we see in Taleb, that's something that my friend Jonathan Pajot talks about also in great detail and in very helpful ways, I think. And it comes across in your book. You discuss the importance of both healthy personal Christian habits and formation and institutions in an increasingly negative society, then in your view, how can Christians engage in public life more effectively at that more personal sort of Jordan Peterson clean your room level for starters, I suppose?
Yeah, well, American Christian engagement in kind of culture and politics in recent years has been very focused around culture war issues. So it's become pigeonholed around culture war issues, abortion and sexuality being the big one. And so I think you're basically, when you're sort of just seen as very prudish and you're pushing kind of prudish, unpopular ideas, people are not going to see you as making a positive contribution. I think we could open the aperture and and look at things in just a broader context. Why not be the solution to the many of the serious problems in our society? And that's where, like, I write a lot about urban policy issues, um, and certainly how I see the world um, is highly influenced by a sort of Christian worldview, if you will, but it's not necessarily like, here is my Christian prescription for nursing homes or something like that. Whereas I write a lot about the various scams and things that I could very easily rewrite them as a sort of preaching denunciation of evil leaders or something like that. I think you can engage on things as a Christian on not just the most controversial social issues. You could engage on a lot of different things. And of course, people do in the United States. We definitely have a government safety net. I mean, yeah, we have much more robust government safety net than people think. But there's still a lot of things that are done in the private sector through churches, homeless shelters in most cities. The homeless care infrastructure is primarily Christian. That's not true in the biggest cities like New York and things like that, but most cities, that's that's the homeless. They run the homeless shelter. So there's a lot of things that people do in terms of poverty relief, halfway houses, prison ministries, things like that, that are very focused on providing tangible help to people in need, which I think is great. But could we become known as like the people who have the best answers to public policy? I keep coming back to this example, but it's the 19th century Quakers in England, and I read a really great article in the London Review of Books about Cadbury, and Cadbury was moving a factory from the UK to Poland, and they were sort of talking to save a buck, and they were sort of talking about how this was really at odds with the Quaker values of Cadbury, which was a Quaker business. And they kind of talked a little bit about the history, and they're like going back to the 19th century when it really was kind of caveat emptor. There was no regulation. It was kind of anything goes in the marketplace. People said, I'm not a Quaker. I think it's a little weird, but like I would prefer to do business with a Quaker business because I know they're not going to rip me off. And there's certain things they're not going to do. They're going to treat their workers well. You're dealing with people that you can trust. And in an era when there was no regulatory state, that was like a big deal. And so one of the examples of the article is like Cadbury, their competitors were putting sawdust and iron filings and other things, mixing those in with chocolate as like fillers, low cost fillers.
Mhm.
And Cadbury wouldn't do that. It's like you buy a chocolate bar from us, it's chocolate. Okay. And like things like that. I don't think, again, it'll never be exactly like that. But, we have like a declining trust, uh, basically politicians who, can't accomplish anything where, it's happening across the West. Why can't we be people who, competently like administer government? So, wow, why don't we go to these guys? Because we know that they care about the public good and other things. So I think there's many opportunities to engage outside of this very narrow aperture that has been seen for a long time. And again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't engage on controversial social issues if that's what they want to do, but like certainly we could do more than that, not just that.
Absolutely. So, in line with what you described before about the managerial element coming in, I've listened to podcasts referring to Jack Ellul and how he lamented this turn within the Christian faith and so on. I think he's maybe overly negative and fatalistic in some ways, but a question around that for me might be to what extent Christians can take, and I suppose especially given the long march through the institutions that people refer to what extent can Christians take back institutions, so to speak, and to what extent do we need to create new organic institutions for our time in line with what you described?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think the times are not always propitious for everything. I do think we have to know like the signs of the times. Um, I think if you go back to the early New Testament church, they were remarkably unconcerned about what the Roman Empire was doing. I mean, that's one of the key things I take away from reading the Pauline epistles is he doesn't really care what Rome is up to all that much. He's like, those who are outside God judges, you deal with the problem in the church. And I think that's an attitude we could learn from that. We could learn to be a lot more concerned about what we're doing than what other people are doing because we don't have our own house in order. And I think that's fair to say. And, um, you know, so, um, so I think they were not really interested in, penetrating institutions of Roman Empire. Although they probably, I'm sure they took advantage of anybody who was in a place of authority in Rome that converted to Christianity was certainly beneficial to them. As the empire came on, when there was more the Constantinian kind of Constantinian settlement, the empire sort of Christianized in a sense. And so I don't think we should abandon institutions necessarily. But I think one of the things that's very clear in general, and this is where my Ivan Illich influence comes in, we've become very overly dependent on institutions as opposed to personal relationships for everything. And we definitely need to be bolstering personal networks and personal relationships at the local scale, family, neighborhood, church. Of course, we can be broader than that. I can have a global network of people that I know, but these need to be like personal, like relationships, that are tangible in substance. Because I think we've become extremely overly reliant on institutions. I mean, there's so many people, and you see these surveys, like large percentages of people today don't have any friends, don't even have a friend, much less anybody else. I just borrowed a wheelbarrow from my neighbor. And like, isn't it nice to be able to borrow something from your neighbor, or my neighbor come over and say, hey, can you help me move this refrigerator? Why, yes, I can. And I think these things really matter. So I think in that sense, we do need to rebalance away from institutions towards more thick networks of interpersonal relationships, which maybe could become instantiated into institutions later. But I think the idea that a bureaucratic institution is the answer to everything is a very modern way of looking at the world. So I think part of it's just going to depend. Again, I don't want to be too prescriptive because we don't know what the future is going to hold, and different people have different consciences, skills, opportunities. Like if you had an opportunity in the United States to go to Harvard, I would say go to Harvard. You'd be kind of crazy to not go to Harvard. If you had opportunities to join these institutions, you can. I think it's great there. But I think again, trust is declining in institutions and deservedly so. So what are we going to do about that? How are we going to actually reform and restructure the institutions? And I do think institutions need to be retired over time. They need to be retired. They need to be reformulated, and then new ones need to be created. And so having some wisdom to do that. I think part of the issue is, unlike the old WASPs who knew how to create and recreate institutions, today's leaders don't know how to do that. To them, it's like, okay, we created NATO 80 years ago. So NATO is our permanent institution that works the same way it always did forever. Instead of thinking, well, what does what does a global security alliance need to look like for the 21st century in today's threats? Not saying NATO should go away, but like maybe NATO should be significantly restructured. Um, Maybe there are different ways to think about security. Maybe the EU should be doing more on security, things of that nature. I don't really know, but I mean, like the idea that like nobody can question. It's like the institutions cannot be questioned. Uh, they cannot be rethought, and that's part of the sclerosis that we have because we're not able to refresh. Whereas if you go back to the mid-century era, they were creating institutions, changing institutions. Oh yeah, well we're in the United States. We need to maybe we should have a rural electrification agency because we need to bring electricity to the country. You know, wow, it's a great idea. Well, what's that of today? What are the ideas for today? We don't really have those. And so I think there's an opportunity to think institutionally in new ways, and maybe we should be challenging our thinking, stretching our mind. I guess what I like about Illich, he's his ideas. I mean, he's so it's radical, deschooling society, stuff like that. You can't really necessarily go live in this aspirational way he describes, but it can be like really stimulate our thinking. And so maybe something like Balaji Srinivasan's The Network State or something like that would be good for thinking about networks and, what is blockchain? What does it mean to have a blockchain institution? Just some of that thinking could help us be creative. We have to creatively engage with the context that we're in institutionally, and different people are going to do it different ways. I guess that's what I'd say.
No, that's excellent. Thank you, Aaron. And it's funny that you mentioned Harvard. I was recently trying to deter my sister from going to Harvard. She was talking about it because I listened to Jordan Peterson and Victor Davis Hanson talk about it and different things. And trying to get her to
Well, say as you will, like Jordan Peterson is a professor at the University of Toronto, which is basically the Harvard of Canada.
yeah.
He has not resigned from his position in an elite university in Canada.
Mhm.
Um, and so I do think we need to look at you look at these things here.
No, no, that's fair enough.
Keep in mind, look at what they do.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, especially for a guy who focuses so much on pragmatism and so on. That might make sense. But at least I suppose he is offering his online university
Right.
and things like that in front
I
of.
like Jordan Peterson, but like you know, let's be a little cautious on like, okay, great. It's like, oh, now that I've been the Harvard professor, he was a Harvard professor. Now that I'm at the University of Toronto, now that I'm a best-selling author, now that I have millions of dollars, I can advocate dropping out of all these institutions. Isn't that great? It's but that doesn't work when you're like 20 and you don't come from an elite background and you're not rich. Okay, you got to like think about life in a little bit of a different different way of doing it.
Hmm.
There's nothing quite like a rich guy telling you, for example, that like money doesn't make you happy. Oh, money's not what it is. Well, you're still got your money. When somebody like Francis of Assisi says, well, I'm going to give away all of my money and live like, a beggar on the streets to help the poor. Um, well, I'm much more willing to listen to what he has to say because he's divested himself of all the benefits of the society that he might denounce.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And there are alternative institutions which I think are springing up, and you see a lot of emphasis in places like Hillsdale in the USA. I know some people there that are really good scholars, and it's an integrated sort of organic environment. They, I think, balance in some ways from what I see online, obviously from a distance. They have the classical education focus, and then they bring in figures like Ian McGilchrist for interviews and he, like yourself, is focusing in on the importance of relator relationships and thinking in along those terms rather than more technocratically and so on. And I think there's some good encouragement, good examples for us to model. I suppose going beyond those extremes of being overly
Right.
critical of other institutions, and I think that's encouraging. But In part from what you described, it reminded me of my friend, Pastor Paul Vanderklay in the States. He's a Reformed pastor from
Oh
South.
yeah, I know Paul. He's great.
So yeah, he's been deeply informed, I know, by your work and that the primacy of relationships, and that's his way of dealing with the meaning crisis. And he does have his different emphases from Peterson and so on, even though he comments often on his work. But inspired in part by him and his estuary protocol and how he seeks to bring together these communities in face to face and going beyond the digital world and using the digital world as a springboard to deeper relationships and so on. I wonder if you might speak to some of the major challenges and changes that are offered by this move to a more digital square. People talk about X or Twitter as the digital square and so on, with Elon Musk as the the obvious example. Does that make sense? Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean it is. There are a lot of challenges. So this academic in the United States, Jonathan Haidt, just wrote a book called The Anxious Generation," basically about how these teenagers who've grown up in really the smartphone era, the smartphone social media era, not just the internet era. They have all these psychological problems and like they get depression and like you always hear about how horrible Instagram is for teen girls and things like that. And so I think there are a lot of things there with social media that are challenging. Um, I think it challenges us to again it sort of it puts an intermediation between us and others, this digitally mediated relationship. So one of the big ways we see this is in how people meet their spouse or their person they're dating. It's overwhelmingly online now. Young people don't even have the concept of how you would meet someone except online. And so, when you're trying to like meet someone of the opposite sex through an app as opposed to real life, something is definitely lost. There. Not that I'm opposed. I mean, I personally would never use online dating. Now, I basically wrote that off. Uh, long before the current swipe app era. So I have no familiarity with Tinder and how it works. Really, I mean, I kind of know the basics, but I've never had a Tinder account. Um, but I think something is off there in it. The other thing is now that the essential infrastructure of society is digital, we have not applied the same kind of regulatory approach that we applied to physical infrastructure. So, for example, the electric company cannot decide that they're not going to take you on as a customer because they don't like your politics. They're common carriers. They're obligated to provide service to everyone. They can only disconnect you if you fail to pay your bill or something like that. Same with the old phone company. You know, yeah, to just they had to give everybody a phone. We didn't like what you're saying on the phone. Well, that doesn't mean we could cancel your phone service. But did these digital platforms, they're essentially privately governed. They're essentially private governments. That's the best way to think of them. And they're not subject to any of this regulation. In fact, they have special statutory exemptions in the United States from even the ordinary regulations that apply to normal businesses. And so this idea that like the digital people who control the digital public square can at their discretion, deplatform you, I think is a major issue. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. And I have no problem with the government regulating these enterprises to do that. Then, of course, from the European perspective, if you're in Ireland, these companies aren't even based in your. I mean, they're based in the United States, right? So that and so that's that's something it becomes difficult to regulate. And of course, the EU has all its regulations and things like that. But it becomes like doubly difficult there. And it's not really possible. Like, unlike an electric utility, Ireland could never sustain its own digital infrastructure apart from other countries' technologies. So I think that's a huge issue. And of course, the people that control these things can manipulate public discourse, manipulate elections. undoubtedly 100%. And uh, they, Act's a good example that, the federal government pressured them to delete certain posts they didn't like, suppress, different stories they don't like, which are, politically, advantageous suppressions to the incumbent administration. And there you go. I mean, and that's what it is. But it's also the case. I don't think you could have a deregulate. You can't have, it can't just be the Wild West either, because these are different. Unlike an actual phone call, which is one to one, this is one to many. It's broadcast, so it's complicated. But I certainly think we don't have great things now.
And given the complexity of some of these challenges, I wonder how do your views compare with thinkers like James Davison Hunter, who you mentioned, who might be more pessimistic, perhaps with wider society, but even he is obviously very hopeful for the faithful presence remnant within the church. And I wonder what gives you hope personally then.
Yeah, well, I actually am not totally on board with the faithful presence idea as it's interpreted in places like New York City. So living in New York City, I saw how the kind of the faithful presence idea was sort of put into practice practically, and now which may not be how Hunter intended it. And I have some issues with it. Um, but I mean, it's not horrible either, though. I mean, I would say it's not terrible, but I'd say his analysis is actually superb. So I agree with the analysis. And again, analysis is easy, prescriptions are hard. What should we do about institutions? I gave you a very long answer that's kind of like, I'm not really sure. That's kind of what it boiled down to. And I think it's really easy to say that. And he's definitely like, really, really top notch academic, to be sure.
I appreciate your humility. That's most admirable, to be honest with you, Aaron. And I suppose we'll close for this afternoon because you've given me plenty of your time and I most appreciate it. So to conclude, maybe where can my viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work and ultimately follow your thoughts and writing it?
The best thing to do is sign up for my newsletter. It's at www.aaronrenn.com, AARONRENN.com. Very easy. Go there, sign up. Everything shows up there. And of course, my book is Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in Anti-Christian Culture. It is very heavily focused on an American evangelical context, so I'll warn you about that. But again, people such as yourself who live in other countries have found it valuable as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for writing it and thank you for your time today. And God bless you and your work, Aaron.
Yours as well.
Thank you so much.